Here are some for as well. The one on the top here is one of the ways that you can define E.
What makes a field more likely to have an unbalanced gender distribution?
Yeah, so is the oh, okay, cool. Like Oliver just said today, I'll be presenting on the role of language in eyewitness memory and remembering who did it in English and Japanese. So just for a brief story of my life, my family moved to China when I was 2 years old in like June of 2013. And my first language was actually Chinese. I only spoke Chinese for the first couple years of my life. And when we moved back, I felt major cognitive dissonance. The teachers taught differently. I felt like different things were expected of me. And on top of all of that, my English was not very fluent. I don't remember a lot, but I do remember trying as hard as I could to fit in and learn about this new culture and environment that I was in, and even shoving aside my Chinese culture to do so. So as I grew older, I eventually grew more interested about how these two cultures in my life fit together, but also how they diverge. And one of the ways in which they do diverge is in their language. So having lived two culturally very different places with very different languages, I grew interested about how language shapes our perception of the world and the relationship between language and thought. And the study that I'm going to talk about today specifically focuses on the relationship between something that I'm going to get into later. Yeah, so actually, yeah, so that's actually a perfect transition into my next slide, because what Nathan just said, the marker dropped, the pen dropped, was a perfect example of non-agentive language. Non-agentive the verb to an agent, which in this case is me. And one of the main places that we see these types of agentive versus non-agentive language is in English. English is a highly agentive language, but some other languages, such as Japanese, are less. So before I get into the study, I'm just going to do as something happened to them, versus the direct or literal voice, the homework was eaten by the dog. There's no speaker in this, and it's just a generic statement of fact. So the main difference between these two is just, was there a speaker that was inconvenienced or influenced by something that happened to them, or was it just a general statement? And these types of constructions are much more common in Japanese because these types of passive voices are much more common in Japanese because the constructions exist. Another example would be the rain fell on me, versus like how we would just normally say, I got caught in the rain. And because these constructions are there, Japanese speakers would be more likely to use this type of thought in their daily speech and thought, which in turn influences how they see the world. So then how we see the world. What we think, what we say, how we process information is all in that language. And what we say is all in that language. So then language technically sets up boundaries for what we can think, and it exists because it reflects a certain way we see the world. And actually, this traces back to the mid-1900s, where these two linguists, Spur and Worf, I think, they hypothesized that language is, the construction of language influences the way we think. And since then, cognitive linguists have been debating not whether that is true or not, but the extent to which it is true. So I just also want to be super clear that language, culture, and mental processes are all hugely interrelated, and there is so much connection between them. But for the sake of time and energy and my own mental processes today, I will only be talking about the relationship between agentive and non-agentive language and memory. Oh, and their hypothesis was called the hypothesis of linguistic relativity. Also the agents of those events. So like the pen that I used myself, so that's what they tested in this experiment as well. They had 49 English speakers and 70 Japanese speakers who were all functionally monolingual, which means that they only spoke one language. Could someone just tell me why that would be super important for this study, that they only spoke one language? Yeah, Daniel?
If they knew another, this mindset that has to relate with the language they speak would probably have a mix of both.
Right. Yeah, exactly, yeah. So this experimental design is basically a quasi-experimental design, meaning that the researchers are just testing to see if there's a difference between what's already there. And so the participants, they had 3 tasks. The first one was orientation memory. This also served as the control task. Basically, they were shown like pictures of 16 objects, like a chair or a trumpet or anything, in 3 different types of orientations. So like the pen, it would be like this or like this. And then they were asked to recall what orientation the object was in. And again, this just served as the control and basically acclimated the participants to get used to that this was going to be a memory experiment. And the second task was when they actually tested the memory of causal agent of person in the white shirt and a person in the black shirt performing these events. So afterwards, they were shown the videos again, but this time with the person in the red shirt. And then they were asked, who did it the first time? Was it or the person in black? This is what they found. And the researchers understand what they just saw. And here are the results from that task. You can see it's speakers were more likely to describe them using agentive language than Japanese speakers. And this graph basically zooms into this data a little bit more. You can see that for English speakers, the data is events. English speakers were still more likely to use agentive descriptions than the Japanese speakers. They encoded the action differently than the English speakers did. And also, that the cause and effect schema kind of carries into our English language, which then prompts English speakers to remember that there is like a causer for an event, even if it is accidental. That didn't get into the encoding of the Japanese participants. And the experiment was conducted the way that it was because the researchers wanted to see if there was a connection between memory and agentive language. But this is not to say that agentive language is the only thing at work here. You might think, what about all of like the other linguistic features that there are? We of course can't test them all at once. So we're saying that agentive language is not the only thing at work, and we know that because there is a relationship between how the participants wrote about the events and their memory of the agents of those events. Are there any questions about the data or anything so far? Yeah.
Do you know why, if they have a specific reason for having a slightly different ratio?
Sorry?
Like why there were fewer participants and like who spoke English versus Japanese?
I have no idea. I was wondering that too. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you go into more depth about what the videos actually were? Were they like audio clips or people doing
Yeah. Yeah, of course. So for like the second task? Yeah, so it was video clips and they were all silent and there were 16 of them of just like different actions. There were a lot of them and I think they even ranked them based on like, yeah. But just like every day, like kind of what I just did in front and they had one of these people perform the event accidentally and one of them perform it intentionally. I'm not really sure how they exactly mark like how an event was accidental or intentional, but then there was like a brief distractor task and then the participants were shown the same action again, but this time with the person in red, and then they were asked if like who did it the first time in the first videos that they saw. Yeah, anything else? Cool. Oh. Charlotte.
I wonder how much of this might have to do with cultural as well as linguistic differences too. Like
Yeah.
if there was a different pair of languages tested that had a more similar or a different culture.
It's a great question too, because thank you, Charlotte, for transitioning to my conclusions and connections. maybe more similar would be compared to each other. But yeah, I just also want to point out that like we cannot generalize the results of this study, obviously, because of like stereotypes, national ideals. Some of you guys might have heard of like Hofstede's cultural dimensions, where he tried to kind of look at values and orientations of countries. I just put the one for Japan and the US here. Yeah, Lucy.
I guess I'm also curious, like you're mentioning cultural dimensions,
Mm-hmm.
and I think in another like dimension, I'm wondering about the role that like age and generations might play into this.
Mm-hmm.
I think especially as it ties with different like identifiers of culture, the extent, I don't know, the ways languages are
Right.
used, especially like I don't know, in these like more controlled
Yeah, for sure.
contexts, it probably has less of an effect. But I feel like I don't know, that might be another thing.
Yeah, and another thing to note was that all of the participants were younger than 25 years old. So, yeah. Anything else? Cool. So you could like, could it be that like the U.S. is sorry, the font is really small, but could be like that the U.S. is more individual, like has a more focus, is more focused on individualism than Japan. We don't know. And this only works on a large scale. We could say that the US tends to be more individualistic, but ultimately we cannot yeah. And I think my third grade self would not have been interested in this at all. But now looking back, I now can understand like all of the different culture differences that were at work when I moved here. And I now know that there is a different world between, Japanese and English. There's a different world between languages that are highly visual and those that aren't. There's a different world between languages that are more agentive versus those that aren't. And we now know that language is not just words, it is a schema, and it will influence what you remember and how you remember it. Thank you.